My name is Ryan Cole, and if you had asked me half a year ago whether I trusted my girlfriend, I would have answered without hesitation. Yes. Not just because I loved her, but because trusting Megan Parker felt natural. We had been together for almost 4 years. By that point, you develop routines, habits, and quiet expectations about each other. We shared an apartment, a grocery list on the fridge, and the kind of comfortable silence that only shows up after years together. Nothing about our relationship looked suspicious from the outside. And honestly, nothing looked suspicious to me either. That's what made the moment everything changed so unsettling. It didn't start with a confession or a dramatic argument. It started with something small enough that, at first, I almost ignored it. A phone screen lighting up. It was a Tuesday evening. Megan had come home later than usual. She said work had been a mess. Meetings running over, some project deadline shifting again. I didn't question it. Her job had been stressful lately, and staying late wasn't completely unusual. But there was something slightly different about her mood. Normally, when she got home late, she looked drained. That evening she seemed energized. Not overly excited, just lighter somehow. She tossed her bag onto the chair, kicked off her shoes, and started talking about random things. Something funny a coworker said, some weird office drama. Then she grabbed a change of clothes and headed for the shower. Her phone was still sitting on the kitchen counter. I wasn't paying attention to it at first. I was leaning against the counter scrolling through emails on my laptop, half reading, half zoning out after a long day of my own. Then the screen lit up. Just a quick notification. Normally, I wouldn't even glance at it. But the phone was facing upward, and the message preview appeared bright against the dim kitchen light. My eyes caught the words before I could stop myself. Last night was worth it. The days without him actually feel real when we're together. For a moment, I just stared at the phone. The sentence didn't make sense right away. My brain tried to process it in pieces. Last night, worth it. Days without him, together. Something about that combination of words felt wrong. I told myself I probably misunderstood it. Maybe it was part of some conversation taken completely out of context. Maybe it was a joke between friends. Maybe I had read it too quickly. Then the phone buzzed again. Another message. Same contact. Tyler. I wish we didn't have to pretend around him. My stomach dropped so suddenly it almost felt like missing a step on the stairs. I wasn't even sure why the reaction was so strong. Maybe it was the wording. Maybe it was the fact that the messages clearly referenced someone else. Someone who apparently existed between them. For a few seconds I just stood there staring at the screen like it might somehow explain itself if I looked long enough. Every instinct told me to put the phone down and ignore it. But curiosity is a dangerous thing when doubt enters your mind. Before I could stop myself, I picked it up. The screen showed only the preview notifications, but even that small glimpse was enough to make my chest tighten. Whoever Tyler was, the conversation didn't sound like a typical exchange between coworkers. I barely had time to think before the bathroom door opened. Steam drifted into the hallway as Megan walked out wrapped in a towel, her hair damp and falling around her shoulders. She stopped the moment she saw the phone in my hand. For a split second there was silence. "What are you doing?" she asked. Her voice wasn't angry. It was more like mild confusion. But there was something else underneath it. Something cautious. I tried to keep my own voice steady. "Who's Tyler?" She blinked. "What?" I turned the phone toward her so she could see the message preview still glowing faintly on the screen. "That," I said, for the briefest moment. So fast it might have been my imagination. I saw something flicker across her face. Surprise. Or maybe calculation. Then it was gone. Megan let out a short laugh. "Oh my God, Ryan," she said, walking past me to grab the phone. "You're seriously doing this right now?" "Doing what?" "Reading into random messages." She unlocked the phone and glanced at the conversation like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. "It's a coworker," she said casually. "Tyler. From marketing." I waited for the rest of the explanation. Came quickly. "He has a weird sense of humor," she added. I frowned. "A weird sense of humor?" "Yeah." She tossed the phone onto the couch like the conversation wasn't important. We joke around during work all the time. That message said, "The days without him feel real, Megan." She sighed like I was being exhausting. "It's sarcasm." "That doesn't sound like sarcasm." "It is if you understand the context," she said. "We were talking about skipping meetings and hiding from our manager." The explanation came too smoothly, too quickly, like she had already prepared it. She crossed her arms and looked at me with mild irritation. "You went through my phone because of a notification?" "I didn't go through it," I said. "It popped up." "And your first thought was cheating?" The word landed between us like something heavy. Cheating. I hadn't even said it. But somehow she had already turned the conversation there. I hesitated. Megan shook her head. "You know what this actually shows?" "What?" "That you don't trust me." Her tone wasn't angry. It was disappointed. And somehow that made me feel like I was the one who had done something wrong. I opened my mouth to respond, but she was already walking toward the bedroom. "Next time," she said over her shoulder, "maybe don't assume the worst about someone you love." The conversation ended there. No confession. No real explanation. Just a strange quiet settling over the apartment. I stood in the kitchen for several minutes staring at nothing in particular. Part of me wanted to believe her, but another part of me couldn't stop replaying those two messages. Last night was worth it. I wish we didn't have to pretend around him. That night Megan acted completely normal. She watched TV with me, laughed at a show we both liked, and fell asleep like nothing unusual had happened. But something inside me had already shifted. For the first time in 4 years, a thought crept into my mind that I couldn't push away. Maybe the calm version of Megan, the one who looked me in the eye and talked about love and trust, wasn't the whole truth anymore. And maybe the messages on that phone weren't a misunderstanding. Maybe they were the first sign that something in our relationship had already started to break. After that night, nothing outwardly changed between Megan and me. We still woke up at the same time every morning. We still argued about whose turn it was to make coffee. We still watched the same shows in the evening and complained about work like every other couple we knew. But something inside my head had shifted in a way I couldn't undo. Once doubt appears, it has a strange way of spreading. At first, it's just a single thought you try to ignore. Then it begins quietly connecting things you never questioned before. Over the next few days, I kept replaying that moment in the kitchen. The message, the way Megan had reacted, the speed of her explanation. At first, I tried to convince myself I had overreacted. People joke strangely at work. Office conversations can look weird out of context. Maybe I had simply stumbled into a private conversation that sounded worse than it actually was. But the more I thought about it, the more other memories started floating back. Small things. Things that had seemed harmless at the time. Now they started lining up differently in my mind. The first thing I realized was that Megan had changed her relationship with her phone. Sounds stupid when you say it out loud. Everyone uses their phone constantly these days. Messages, emails, social media, it's normal. But Megan had always been relaxed about it. She used to leave her phone anywhere in the apartment. On the kitchen counter. On the couch. Sometimes even in the bedroom while she showered. That had slowly changed. Over the last few months she had developed a new habit of placing the phone face down wherever she put it. Not aggressively, not like she was hiding something, just automatically. Screen down. Every time. And when she walked into another room, the phone usually went with her. Even if she was just grabbing a glass of water. Even if she was going to the bathroom for 30 seconds. At the time, I hadn't questioned it. Now it stood out in my mind like a red flag I somehow missed. The second thing I started noticing was her schedule. Megan had always hated working late. She complained about overtime constantly. Her job was the kind where people pretended everything was urgent even when it wasn't. Yet suddenly she had started staying later. Not every night, but often enough to notice. At first it had been once a week. Then twice. Sometimes she texted me around 6 saying she had another meeting. Other times she said she needed to finish something before leaving. Again, none of it sounded suspicious by itself. But when I thought about the timing, something bothered me. Those late nights had started around the same time that Tyler's messages appeared. Then there were the changes in her mood. Megan had always been emotionally steady. She wasn't dramatic, and she rarely swung between extremes. But over the past few months she had started having strange shifts in energy. Some evenings she came home distant and quiet, barely speaking while scrolling through her phone. Other nights she arrived in an unusually good mood, almost glowing in a way that felt unfamiliar. I had assumed it was just work stress. Now I wasn't so sure. Another detail surfaced in my memory one evening while I was making dinner. Perfume. Megan owned several perfumes, but she rarely wore them unless we were going somewhere together. Yet recently she had started using one of the stronger ones almost every day. The scent lingered when she walked past. I remembered asking about it once. She had shrugged and said something simple. Trying something new. At the time I hadn't thought twice. Now it felt like another piece of a puzzle I didn't want to see. Then there were the clothes. It wasn't like Megan had suddenly reinvented her wardrobe, but she had started buying things I didn't remember her looking at before. New dresses, different shoes. One evening she came home carrying a shopping bag with a dress I had never seen her wear. "Where are you planning to wear that?" I asked casually. "Work event maybe," she said. "Or dinner sometime." But we hadn't gone out anywhere lately, and the work event she mentioned never actually happened. Still, none of those details alone proved anything. That was the frustrating part. Every time I started building a theory in my mind, another voice pushed back. "You're overthinking this. People change routines. Work gets busy. New clothes aren't a crime." But then one memory stood out more than the others. About a month before the message from Tyler, Megan had suggested something that felt strange even at the time. We had been sitting on the couch late at night, watching something neither of us was really paying attention to. Out of nowhere she said, "Do you ever think couples get too comfortable?" I looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Like," she said slowly, "when people stop appreciating each other because everything becomes routine." I shrugged. "That happens sometimes, I guess." She nodded like she had already been thinking about it for a while. "Maybe relationships need space sometimes." "Space. To test things," she said. "To see if people actually miss each other." I remember laughing. "Are you suggesting we break up for a week or something?" She smiled, but it wasn't a very convincing smile. "Not break up," she said. "Just take a pause." I thought she was joking. The conversation drifted away after that. But remembering it now made my chest tighten, because suddenly the idea sounded very different. Back then I thought she was talking about relationships in general. Now it felt like she had already been preparing the ground for something else. Something that required distance. Something that required time away from me. And the more I replayed the last few months in my mind, the more one uncomfortable possibility kept forming. What if the message from Tyler wasn't the beginning of the story? What if it was simply the first time I noticed it? And if that was true, then whatever was happening between them might have started long before that night in the kitchen. I didn't have proof. Not yet. But for the first time, the idea that Megan might be lying to me didn't feel impossible anymore. It felt like a pattern I had only just begged *n to see. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. For about a week after the messages from Tyler appeared, I tried to behave like nothing had changed. That might sound strange, but I wasn't ready to confront Megan again without knowing more. The first conversation had ended with me looking like the paranoid one, and I didn't want to repeat that mistake. So I watched. Not in some obsessive, dramatic way. I didn't follow her or check her phone every minute, but I started paying attention to things I would have ignored before. And the strange thing was, the more I paid attention, the more uncomfortable the pattern became. The late evenings at work didn't stop. If anything, they became more frequent. Sometimes Megan texted me before I could even ask. "Still at the office. Big project." Other nights she sent a quick message around 7. "Running late again. Don't wait for dinner." Her explanations always sounded reasonable, but something about the rhythm of it felt rehearsed. Then something happened that made the situation harder to ignore. About 2 weeks after the kitchen incident, Megan came home unusually quiet. She walked straight past me into the bedroom without the usual conversation about her day. I asked if everything was okay. "Just tired," she said. She didn't elaborate. That evening she barely touched her dinner. Instead she kept checking her phone, the screen lighting up again and again on the table beside her. Each time it buzzed, she flipped it over instantly, face down. The movement had become almost automatic. I pretended not to notice, but inside I could feel the same uneasy pressure building again. The next day she brought up the subject that had been floating between us for weeks. We were sitting in the living room when she said it casually. "Maybe we should take a break." The words landed heavier than she seemed to expect. "A break?" I asked. She nodded slowly, like she had already rehearsed the explanation in her mind. "Just a little space," she said. "To think." "Think about what?" "About us," Megan replied. "About where things are going." Her tone was calm, almost gentle, but the timing felt strange. "You brought this up before," I said. "Remember?" "Yeah," she admitted. "I've been thinking about it more." I studied her face carefully. "What exactly would that look like?" "Just a few days apart," she said quickly. "No pressure, no expectations, just time to clear our heads." Something about the way she phrased it bothered me. "Clear our heads from what?" She hesitated. "From routine," she said eventually. "From everything feeling automatic." I didn't answer right away. Part of me wondered if she was telling the truth. Another part of me couldn't stop hearing those messages from Tyler. "I wish we didn't have to pretend around him." Pretend. The word echoed in my head while Megan continued explaining. "It might actually help us," she said. "Sometimes people appreciate each other more when they have a little distance." "And what would you do during this break?" I asked. She shrugged. "See friends. Relax. Think." The explanation sounded simple. Too simple. But I didn't argue with her. "Not yet." "Okay," I said finally. "If you think that's what you need." Relief flashed across her face so quickly it almost startled me. "Really?" "Yeah," I said. "Really." The break officially started the next morning. Megan packed a small bag and said she was going to stay with a friend across the city. She kissed me on the cheek before leaving, acting like the situation was temporary and harmless. "Just a few days," she said. "Sure," I replied. But the moment the door closed behind her, something inside me hardened. Because deep down, I didn't believe the explanation anymore. Not after the messages. Not after the sudden request for space. And definitely not after the look of relief on her face when I agreed. For most of that first day, I stayed at home trying to focus on work. But my concentration was gone. The thought that Megan might be somewhere else with someone else kept pushing its way into my mind. By evening, the pressure became unbearable. So I decided to leave the apartment for a while. I drove across the city without a clear destination, just trying to clear my thoughts. That's when I saw her. It happened completely by accident. I was stopped at a red light near a part of town Megan had specifically said she wouldn't be visiting. And across the street, walking along the sidewalk, was Megan. She wasn't alone. The man beside her was tall, broad-shouldered, and looked completely comfortable walking next to her. They weren't touching, but they were close enough that the distance between them felt familiar. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. I recognized him immediately. Tyler. The same name that had appeared on her phone. The same coworker she said had a weird sense of humor. The light turned green behind me. Cars started honking, but I barely noticed, because in that moment something inside me settled with cold, painful clarity. The break hadn't been about thinking. It hadn't been about space. It had been about freedom. Freedom to be with him without hiding it. And suddenly every strange detail from the past few months, the late nights, the phone, the perfume, the conversations about space, fit together in a way that was impossible to ignore. I didn't follow them. I didn't confront them. Instead, I kept driving. Because by that point, I already understood something important. The messages hadn't been a misunderstanding. They had been a warning. And now the truth was standing right in front of me. Seeing Megan with Tyler that evening should have triggered an explosion. At least that's what people imagine when they picture betrayal. Confrontations in the street, angry phone calls, demands for explanations. But none of that happened. Instead, something much colder settled inside me. When the light turned green and the car behind me started honking, I simply drove forward and kept going. I didn't follow them. I didn't call Megan. I didn't even send a message asking where she was. Because in that moment I already knew enough. Or at least I thought I did. Still, the human mind has a strange relationship with truth. Even when the evidence is standing right in front of you, part of you keeps searching for another explanation. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe they had simply run into each other. Maybe the messages had been misleading. Maybe the break really was just about thinking. Those thoughts kept circling my head as I drove around the city that night. I didn't go home immediately. I parked near the river and sat there for almost an hour staring through the windshield, replaying the scene again and again. Megan walking beside him, close enough to suggest familiarity, relaxed, comfortable, not surprised to see him. Eventually the uncomfortable truth pushed its way through the excuses. She had lied. About the break. About where she would be. About Tyler. But even then I didn't confront her. Because another idea had big asterisk N forming in my mind. If Megan had been lying for months, confronting her now would only give her time to hide whatever was really happening. And if I wanted the truth, I needed to see the full picture. So instead of driving back to the apartment right away, I made a quiet decision. I would wait. The next morning Megan texted me around 10. "Hope you're doing okay." The message looked normal, casual, almost caring. I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. "Yeah, just working." A few seconds later another message appeared. "This break might actually help us." The words felt strange after what I had seen the night before. But I kept my response simple. "Maybe." She didn't text again that day. For the next 24 hours I tried to behave like everything was still uncertain. Like I didn't already suspect the truth. But inside my head the pieces kept moving. Late that evening I remembered something important. Megan's laptop. She had taken some clothes when she left for the break. But she hadn't taken her computer. It was still sitting on the desk in the corner of the living room. I hadn't touched it before, partly because it felt like crossing a line. But after seeing her with Tyler, that line didn't feel so important anymore. I walked over to the desk and opened the laptop slowly. The screen lit up, and Megan had made a mistake. Her messaging app was still open. For a few seconds I just stared at the screen, my heart beating harder than I expected. Part of me already knew what I was going to find, but seeing it was still different. The conversation at the top of the list had only one name, Tyler. My hands rested on the keyboard for a moment before I clicked the message thread. The chat window opened instantly, and the first message I saw made my stomach drop. "Your break idea worked perfectly." I kept reading. Megan had responded only a few minutes later. "I told you he'd agree if I framed it the right way." My chest tightened. There was more. "Now we finally get a few days without pretending." The words blurred for a second as I leaned closer to the screen. Pretending. The same word from the message notification in the kitchen. But this time the meaning was unmistakable. I scrolled further up. The conversation stretched back weeks. Then months. There were messages about meeting after work. Messages about excuses. Messages about how careful they needed to be. One message in particular stood out. Tyler had written it late one night. "Are you sure he doesn't suspect anything?" Megan's reply came a minute later. "He's not that observant." For a moment I felt something strange inside my chest. Not just anger. Something sharper. Humiliation. Because while Megan and Tyler were planning their secret meetings, I had been sitting at home believing every explanation she gave me. I kept scrolling. More plans. More lies. Then I saw something that made everything completely clear. A message from 2 days before the break. Tyler. "So when does the break happen?" Megan. "Soon. I'm bringing it up tonight." Tyler. "Perfect. And finally, then we don't have to sneak around anymore." I stopped reading. The room suddenly felt much quieter than before, the air heavier. The truth was no longer a suspicion. It was right there on the screen. The affair hadn't started after the break. The break had been part of the plan, carefully prepared, carefully explained, and carefully executed. I closed the laptop slowly and sat back in the chair. For several minutes, I didn't move. I didn't feel the explosive rage people usually describe in situations like this. Instead, there was a strange calm settling over me. Because the moment doubt disappears, something else takes its place. Clarity. And now I finally understood something important. Megan thought I was confused. She thought I was sitting at home trying to figure out my feelings during this break. She thought she had fooled me. What she didn't know was that the moment I closed that laptop, I had already started thinking about something else entirely. Not confrontation, not arguments, but preparation. After I closed Megan's laptop, I didn't move for a long time. The apartment was completely quiet. The same quiet that had once felt comfortable now felt strange, like the place no longer belonged to the life I thought I had. For the first few minutes, my mind didn't produce any clear thoughts. I simply sat there staring at the dark screen of the laptop, replaying the messages I had just read. Your break idea worked perfectly. I told you he'd agree. He's not that observant. Each sentence carried a different kind of weight. Not just betrayal, but something worse, calculation. This hadn't been a spontaneous mistake. It hadn't been a moment of weakness. It had been planned, carefully, patiently, and the more I thought about it, the more one realization became impossible to ignore. Megan hadn't just been lying to me. She had been studying me, studying how I reacted, studying what I would believe, studying how to present the break in a way that sounded thoughtful instead of suspicious. That realization should have made me furious. But strangely, it didn't. Not immediately. Instead, a cold sense of focus began replacing the confusion that had followed the messages from Tyler. The truth was clear now, which meant the next step wasn't about discovering anything. It was about deciding what to do with that truth. I stood up from the desk and walked slowly around the apartment. 4 years of shared life were scattered everywhere. Photos on the shelves, her shoes by the door, a sweater she had left on the couch. Looking at those things now felt like looking at objects from someone else's story. For the first time since all of this started, the situation felt simple. Not emotionally simple, but logically simple. Megan had already chosen her path. The only question left was how I would respond to it. And one thing became clear very quickly. I wasn't going to explode. I wasn't going to send angry messages or demand explanations over the phone. Because anger would only give her something she could work with. Excuses, deflection, more lies. No. If Megan had spent months planning her deception, then my response needed to be quieter, more deliberate. I returned to the desk and opened the laptop again. This time I wasn't reading the messages. I was documenting them. One by one, I saved *TS of the conversation between Megan and Tyler. The messages about the break. The plans. The jokes about me being not that observant. Each *T felt strangely clinical, like collecting evidence in a case that had already been decided. When I finished, I closed the laptop again. The next step was practical. Megan and I shared several things that connected our lives together. Subscriptions, bills, joint payment apps. Things that had never seemed important before suddenly felt very relevant. I opened my own computer and started reviewing everything carefully. Streaming accounts, phone plans, automatic payments. Took longer than I expected. Not because it was difficult, but because there were so many small details tying our lives together. 4 years creates a lot of invisible connections. One by one, I began separating them, removing shared payment methods, canceling services, updating passwords. The work was methodical, almost boring, but with every step something inside me felt lighter. Because with every account I separated, Megan's presence in my life became smaller, more distant. By midnight, I had finished most of it. But there was one more practical matter to consider. The apartment. Technically, the lease was under my name. Megan had moved in with me about 2 years after we started dating. At the time, it had felt like a step forward. Now it meant something else. It meant the apartment wasn't something we needed to argue about. I walked into the bedroom and looked around. Most of the furniture belonged to me. The bed, the desk, the shelves. Megan had added decorations, clothes, personal items, but the space itself had always been mine. That detail made the situation even clearer, because suddenly the question of where things would go felt easy to answer. I didn't need to leave, which meant eventually she would. But I wasn't going to rush the situation. Not yet, because there was still one thing Megan didn't know. She thought the break was working. She thought I was at home reflecting on our relationship. She thought she still controlled the story. And that misunderstanding gave me something valuable. Time. Time to finish separating everything. Time to prepare for the moment when the truth would finally surface. Before going to bed that night, I looked at my phone. There was one new message from Megan. "Hope you're sleeping okay. This space might be good for us." I stared at the words for a few seconds. Then I typed a short reply. "Yeah, I think it's helping." Technically, that wasn't even a lie, because the space between us really was helping. It was giving me the distance I needed to see the situation clearly. And for the first time since that night in the kitchen, I realized something important. Megan believed she was the one controlling this break. She believed she had designed it perfectly. But what she didn't realize was that the moment I closed that laptop, the break had stopped being her plan. And quietly, without her knowing it, it had become mine. The next few days passed quietly. Megan continued texting occasionally, pretending the break was about reflection. I answered briefly, giving her nothing to question. Meanwhile, I kept organizing my life without her. Documents, finances, subscriptions, everything that tied us together was slowly being separated. The more I worked through those details, the calmer I felt. Megan believed she was enjoying freedom without consequences. What she didn't realize was that every hour of that break was bringing her closer to a reality she hadn't prepared for. 2 days later, something unexpected happened. While reviewing the messages I had saved, I noticed a name mentioned in one of Tyler's conversations. Olivia. At first it seemed random, just another person from his life. But the context felt strange. The more I read, the clearer it became that Tyler wasn't as free as Megan probably believed. There was someone else in the picture. A girlfriend who, if she ever discovered the truth, might see the situation very differently than Megan expected.